It's so great to see so many people here. On behalf of CJP, I want to welcome you all and say thank you. This is God's work, and our community has many, many things to support, and we are so proud and grateful to have all of you as people within our community teaching our youngest children, teaching each other, teaching parents. We're a community in many different places. And today I'm really pleased to present and introduce Sara Shapiro-Plevin. Sara comes to us from New York. She's worked at the Jewish Education Project. She's led a congregational school. She is now consulting in her own firm, Rimonim Consulting. She is a network weaver, just like everyone in this room. You may not call yourselves that. That's what you do. You are relationships people. She's going to give us a little language. She's going to validate the work that you do. She's going to hopefully bring it to a new level, help you think about it from the inside out. She's presenting workshops throughout the day and last evening. And without further ado, Sara.
So I want to thank you for that beautiful bit of Torah that we started with, which I think is a great way to start a conversation about stories. About 2 weeks ago, the principal of my son's school had a talk about what it's like for fifth graders. I have a 10-year-old son. And she made the really startling announcement that fifth grade is the last year in which parents can tell stories and read stories at night to their kids. I heard a little bit of shock, right? I was stunned. I happen to have grown up in a home where my parents read to me and told me stories every night for a very, very, very long time until I was a teenager. My mom told me stories from books. My mom was an early childhood educator, and my dad told me stories, told me the stories of his youth. And I was born to listen to stories and to hear stories and then to tell stories. And I'm here to share with you about the power of stories and why stories are an important point of connection. And it happens that you all already, as educators, know so much about listening to stories and the value of stories and stories as a point of connection. Now, you all know why stories are important. Stories are important because they make you feel good. They convey information, and they're a part of a ritual that so many of us experience. We have the opportunity to be active participants in stories, or for those of us who are passive, we have the chance to be passive participants in listening to stories. They are visual, they are compelling, they share values. Sometimes we can totally check out when listening to a story, and they can make us relaxed. They can energize us. Stories convey so much power, but I want you to know that when I went to Google the word stories, I didn't come up with any pictures. I came up with books, and that was all. And I felt really sad that that was all that stories became about when we decided to talk about stories, just in the internet, right? That's not the way that we talk about stories in the real world. But when we think about stories, it's so much more than books. And stories are important for so much more than what they look like when they're written down. So I want to think about what stories we like best. It happens that we all probably could spend some time thinking about the stories that we like the best. I will never forget some of the books that my son liked the best, right? Those of you who have been teaching for many, many years, you know the books in the classroom that the kids return to year after year after year. You know the stories that moved your kids at bedtime. You know the stories that were told around the campfire. You know the stories that emerged out of your family tradition that your parents may have shared with you, generation after generation. The family lore, right? The family stories that were told generation after generation. You know the stories that you like the best, the stories that you connected with. We also know the stories that we really prefer not to hear, and we probably have a sense why, but we may not understand exactly why. So I want to think for a minute about the Jewish people's story. This is the Jewish people's story. Can anybody want to take a guess what it is? This is Yetziat Mitzrayim, right? This is the text. This is the text. This is straight from Exodus. In teeny tiny print. There are actually t-shirts. You can get t-shirts made with this all over it. This, you can, and book bags. They're really cool. This is our people's story. This is the story of Pesach. This is the story that guides us. This is our narrative. And this is the story that we retell year after year. We revisit it during the weekly Torah portion. We revisit it at the Pesach Seder. And every year, the Jewish people tells this story. You as early childhood educators know that this is the story that is in so many ways so compelling. It has frogs, it has hail, it has lice, it has blood, it has a really bad guy, and it has a lot of really amazing characters. It's a story that is tremendously memorable, but we want to understand why. So the central commandment, the central mitzvah of Pesach is V'higadat levincha. This is not a great picture of a contemporary Seder. It's not a contemporary Seder, although this may be a picture of a Seder that you remember from your past, right? You look at the skeptical grandma on the right-hand side with the horn-rimmed glasses. The original form of Jewish storytelling may have been sitting around a table, right? Or sitting around the floor of a tent, telling family stories, telling the stories of our history to our children. We now do that at the Seder. We tell the story of the Jewish people and the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt, to a new generation. And we go through, and when we tell that story, we ask questions about it. We engage with the story. We use props. We use songs. We tell the story in a million different ways. Every year it's different. Every year the people who participate in the telling of the story are different. Every year when we come to that experience, we're different. And every year we fulfill a central Jewish commandment to retell that story, because stories and connection through those stories are a central Jewish value. So this idea that stories convey connection come to us in a way to express the idea that our full bodies can participate in learning. The Pesach Seder engages our entire body in the telling of a story. How? We use our eyes to feast on the beautiful table before us. We look at the symbols that we taste, we sing songs, we express the entire experience through our senses. And whole person learning, which I first encountered through the work of Michael Ben-Avith from the Yale Child Study Center, really helps to convey that there are a full range of senses that we can use to learn, right? We all know this. But when employed in the context of stories, there are new ways to approach telling and listening to stories. So when we think about telling stories and connecting to stories, I want to offer you a quick way to frame storytelling so that you can connect both as storytellers and as story listeners. So to think about how your whole person connects with stories, this is both for you as teachers and for you as listeners. You want to think about how the story sounds, right? Because we all know that when you just read a book and you tell the story just the way it is so incredibly boring. You want to think about what's visually appealing. This may involve props. This may involve learning how to hold a book so that you can read it upside down. It may involve all kinds of skills that you never imagined. Puppets, who knows? But it may involve learning how to tell a story with your eyes. It also may how to use your face to convey messages through stories. You also want to think about your body, how you use your body to tell stories, and also how you use your body to receive stories. You want to think about how storytelling and how story listening is a kinesthetic experience. When you tell a story, are you involving your body, or are you just sitting there? Right? I hear your laughter because you know that that's a really important thing. But also, when you're listening to stories, are you engaged in the story that you're listening to, or are you a passive recipient of that story? The soul. This is really not something that we think about when we think about telling stories or receiving the stories of other people. What actually in the story that you are hearing and telling connects to your Jewish self or to your soul? How does this nourish you? And to give your listeners and your tellers an opportunity to think about that really elevates the stories that we hear and that we tell to a new level. And then your heart. What about stories connects to your emotions? We sometimes don't allow ourselves to go to that place, and we want to give our storytellers and our story listeners a chance to really connect stories with emotions. One of my son's favorite books is a book called How Are You Peeling? I don't know if any of you are familiar with it. It's a really great book. Lots of fruit, lots of vegetables. It's a really great book that helps listeners to engage with the idea that we have emotions, and it's okay to talk about them. It's okay to think about them. So I want you to think about 3 categories of storytelling and of story listening, and what ways you can connect with stories. When you're the teller of a story, what changes? How do you connect with your audience? How do you connect with perhaps the single person who's listening to you? When you're the listener, what changes? How do you engage your body and your mind, your emotions, when you're the listener? And what happens when you're with a group? Perhaps it's a group of parents who you're telling a story to, or a community, or maybe it's a group of infants who you're telling a story to, or a group of 5-year-olds. Where are the differences? So to think about being a teller or a listener, or what changes when you're with an individual or with a group. The last piece that I'd like to share with you is really, I think, the beginning in some ways of the Jewish story. Once upon a time, we were just the people of the spoken word. And then we began to write down our stories. We began to be the people of the book. This is the first Mishnah from Pirkei Avot. Moses received the Torah from Sinai and transmitted it to Joshua. Joshua transmitted it to the elders to the prophets, and the prophets transmitted it to the men of the Great Assembly. The first text that tells the story of the transmission of the oral tradition throughout the generations. This is a text from our rabbinic literature about the transmission of stories. When it started with Moses, it was one story. It was like a game of telephone. By the time it got to the men of the Great Assembly, it was a completely different story. But I want you to imagine all of the different ways that those listeners had to engage their bodies, their hearts, their minds, their souls, to be able to carry that work forward so that it became something that was valuable enough for us here to convene around and to carry forward. As you spend today learning and gathering, I want you to think about all the stories that you're collecting and transmitting. And when you leave here today and you go back to your work, take those stories with you and carry them forward, not just with your intellect, but with your entire body. Have a great day.